tonight's stream is going to be discussing conflict resolution, and there's a lot to discuss, as I was kind of saying before we started. So our major book tonight that we're dealing with is this one right here. It's called Negotiating the Non-negotiable, How to Resolve Your Most Emotionally Charged Conflicts. And it's written by this cool dude, Daniel Shapiro, who has a pretty long, impressive record with what he's done and what he's been a part of in terms of dealing with conflict. He's hosted a wide range of kind of workshops, I guess, all over the planet, dealing with conflict in the Middle East, dealing with businesses and CEOs and country like political affairs and things like that. So it's such an interesting read. I highly recommend, if you have a local library or an Amazon account and some extra cash. I think that this is an incredibly insightful book. I've been super sucked into it and really, really enjoying it. So I hope that you guys are as interested in the information. So anyone who, hey Carlos, I hope you have a good night. Hopefully one day we can actually line up stream where you can come. So there it is, the link to the book. All of us here have dealt with conflict at some point or another. And I bet if I could ask you right now, you'd probably have, maybe it'll take you a minute, but you'd have a few things that you could think of off the top of your head that bother you on a day-to-day basis that would boil down to the idea of conflict. So a lot of what I'm going to be discussing, I'm going to use interpersonal relationship issues that I've had in order to illustrate like a real life situation, I guess, which I'm really not looking forward to. But I also did want to say that just because I'm using that as an example doesn't mean that that's the only way that this stuff pertains. This can also pertain to like disagreeing with someone's political beliefs or religious beliefs or other identity factors. Anything that you can think of that heats you up is a cause for conflict. And all of these issues kind of come from the same space, whether they're just between you and one other person or if it's between you and a whole group of people. So in this book, the author kind of talks about the fact that there are certain different things that you can appeal to when you're trying to resolve a conflict. You can appeal to a person's rationality and you can appeal to a person's emotions, but both of these things end up having limits. And I'm sure that a lot of you can understand that because, as I said, we've all been in conflict at one point or another. And something that tends to bother people, at least it bothers me, is like I don't enjoy the fact that I can get so emotional over something that it doesn't, even if I can see the logic that nullifies whatever I'm feeling, sometimes it's still really hard for me to like back down from my pride or my wounded ego or my whatever like inner thing I feel very attached to. So rationality doesn't always bridge the gap, and appealing to emotions also doesn't always bridge the gap because these things are very deep-seated, right? At the same time, sometimes it seems kind of ridiculous, like, why is this thing that seems so small so deep-seated? And you can see this, I feel like people are trying to articulate this a lot lately on like Twitter and stuff when they're like, you know, wow, you must really have like, you must be really sad in your life, or you must not have a whole lot going on, or like people will be like, why does this bother you so much? Like, how is it that you can get so worked up over the way that another person is living their life? And I think that that's kind of a valid question in a way, but it also has a very valid answer. And I don't think that many people can ever really articulate that valid answer, because I don't think that we all know fully what that answer is. And this book, I think, does a really, really good job of helping to learn how to answer that. And in defining what the problem is, we can become aware of it and we can ultimately change it, which is the goal, right? None of us really want to live in a state of conflict unless it's playing into some sort of emotional need that we have, which is something that we'll also discuss in a little bit. So the thing that we can appeal to, however, is identity. People seek meaning in their existence. A lot of the time, I think I would say that my mood is like in an existential crisis. That's like the state that I kind of hover in all the time, is like I'm worried about, what am I doing with my life? What am I doing with my career? What am I doing with my relationship? What am I doing with where I'm living? Like, how am I spending my free time? Almost every single thing that would be an identity marker for me is under question all the time. And that's a really difficult place to sort of live in, like the middle, where you're just really not sure what the hell you're doing, because humans want to have meaning. They want to have a purpose on this planet, and something that they can like look at and be proud of and feel like they are worthy of being here, like their life matters, and like they've made an impact. And the interesting thing about this is that identity is both a fluid thing and a fixed state. So in some ways, we think about our identity, and I don't know if you guys have any examples you want to shout out to, but there are certain things about ourselves that we consider to be true no matter what, kind of, you know? And they'd vary. So for me particularly, I don't know, I think I'll probably always be a girl. That kind of just seems like a pretty fixed thing for me. I don't really have any desire to become a boy as much as I don't really enjoy being a girl all the time. That seems like a fixed part of my identity. Not believing in like a higher power, like a Catholic, goodness, why can't I say this? Catholic God or Christian God. That seems like something that's pretty fixed in me, although it could be fluid at some point later in my life. Who knows? The fact that I am a college graduate, that's something that's a fixed part of my identity because it happened. That can't be taken away. On the other hand, there are a gamer, that's a good one too. I feel like I'll always be a gamer, because even if I quit playing games, like for 15, well, more than that, really for my whole life so far, I have played video games every week, if not every day. Hey Days, how's it going? And hey Ultimus, how's it going? So we have elements that feel very, very fixed about who we are, and then we have other elements that kind of feel more fluid, and those ones can be kind of touchy sometimes, or not. Sometimes you don't really have that much of an emotional investment in them. For example, I don't know, I was going to use the God thing, but that's kind of like a big one. But if for some reason my opinion was swayed on that, it wouldn't bother me on like a core level. I wouldn't feel like my life had like been completely disrupted if for some reason later on in life I started believing in God. I would be okay with that, because it doesn't like threaten any part of what I believe as my identity. So when you're dealing with relationships, identity is like a huge, huge deal. And this author, as I told you guys, he kind of did a lot of like workshops and things like that. And in one of them that he refers to a lot throughout this book, he's talking about how what he does is he gets all these people, heads of wherever, or CEOs, or religious world leaders, whatever. They all come into some sort of a conference room, and he hands them all a list of questions for them to answer. He breaks them into like groups, and so each group is at its own sort of table, and he hands them a huge list of questions that he says that they all have to come to an agreement on to form their little coalition within like 50 minutes, okay? And everyone's like, okay, sure, why not? And then they see the list of questions, and it's really, really controversial topics. It's things like abortion, religion, like politics, everything that we all argue about all the time. That's what all the questions are. So people become very outraged, and they're like, how do we only have like 50 minutes to do this? This is ridiculous. There's no way we're going to come to a conclusion. And he is like, well, you have to, like that's just how it's going to be. And then at a certain like point later on in the exercise, I guess, when everyone's sort of come to their conclusion, an alien role player comes in and is like, blah, 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 you guys are going to lose your planet. I'm going to blow up the world, the earth, if you guys can't decide on one coalition for everyone to back. So even though these groups have, within the last hour, essentially, come up with their like Declaration of Independence, what they believe in and everything, how they decide to answer these questions, and the stake of the planet is on the line, like the world is going to blow up if they can't choose one group. It seems like 9 times out of 10, these incredibly intelligent people who are complex and have compassion and the ability to reason and everything can't come to a decision, and the world ends up blowing up. They never win the game. With all of their abilities and intelligence, they cannot decide on one group to follow. And what's interesting about that is the fact that they are fighting for principles that they only chose within the last hour. So some of the things that they're arguing about might not even be things that they really believe in their day-to-day life. They could be a part of a tribe who says that it's for abortion and they're vehemently against abortion in their everyday life, but they've become so attached to this group that they're a part of that they can't give that up. People become unwilling to compromise because they are stuck in their sort of idea of this is what it needs to be, and anyone who doesn't agree with me is whatever, stupid or whatever the case. They really look down on those people. So that was a very, very interesting sort of thing to read about, and he brings it up in different ways throughout the book, because he's done it with a lot of different people, and it's very interesting to see like people who go from like laughing and talking and having a good time before the exercise starts. Some of them, like one lady ended up standing on a stool and like screaming about how the patriarchy was like ruining this exercise or something, okay? So it's insane. And at the end, he would like ask the people, do you think that anyone here acted irrationally like during this? And without fail, every single person will raise their hand and be like, yes, people acted irrationally. So sometimes we can spot the fact that people are being irrational, and maybe we can't spot the fact that we are being irrational. So there's this very interesting space he talks about between us and the people who we are fighting against in whatever conflict. So if you want to think of it as believers and non-believers in a religion, or two religions against each other, or Democrats versus Republicans, or anti-vaxxers versus people who believe in science, or whatever, however you want to see the conflict, there are always two sides, right, to any conflict. And there's a space that he describes that's not literal, it's not tangible, but a sort of emotional space between the two groups. And when that space gets filled with tension, anger, any sort of really negative feelings, it becomes almost impossible to resolve the conflict. And you can see this a lot in long-term relationships too. So like sometimes you develop a pattern with people who are around you, whether they're your family or your spouse or the person you're dating or your brother or sister, whatever. Like you have a certain relationship dynamic with them that can continually crop up and affect that emotional space in between you and that person. And it seems like arguments just sort of either stalemate or fall into the same routine over and over once that happens. And these are the dynamics that we're going to look at and try to identify so that we can learn how to combat them. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've been in that situation with a lot of people in my life, and it's incredibly frustrating and kind of sad. Like the person who I had dated in a long-term relationship when I lived in Virginia, that was like really a sad version of this to me because I couldn't understand what was going wrong and why things kept unfolding the same way over and over and over again, even though I didn't want them to. So you kind of feel powerless sometimes in the state of conflict when these patterns develop. And yeah, so that's an interesting point that you make. You say, I developed some bad patterns and habits around certain friends, and when they went away, and they went away when I stopped hanging out with them. So that kind of brings up a good point that sometimes the patterns are as a result of the other person. Sometimes they're as a result of ourselves. But the important thing to keep in mind is that we all have some sort of inner emotional state that's driving our relationships with every single person that we meet. So whomever you know in your life, think about people who you know, whether it's your mom, your brother, your dad, your sister, your boyfriend, girlfriend, auntie, whatever. All of those people have their own inner emotional like voice that's going to help control the way that they interact with people, and none of us know it consciously. That's the part that kind of sucks. That's the part that requires you to sit down and figure it out, because these things become ingrained in us, and I'll definitely show some examples of that as well. So I guess the bottom line is that conflict can sometimes feel very fixed and immutable, but it actually isn't. It's just the way that we go about it, the things that we know or don't know about it. All of these things can be contributing factors to a sort of stalemate that makes conflict feel impossible to resolve. And you might be able to think about someone that you feel that way about. For me, the easiest example to think about is when I watch Republicans versus Democrats. I don't really prescribe to either party because politics just kind of infuriates me, in this country at least. But when I watch on social media or wherever people fight about these things, it's insane. And sometimes I just feel like they're never gonna fix it. Or even if you look at like Israel versus Palestine and the whole controversy over the Holy Land and like Judaism versus everything, like the whole conflict over there, the rest of the world is like, they're never going to solve that. They're never going to get over that. It's just very interesting because usually the people inside of the conflict can't really see why that is the case. And so things just perpetuate over and over and over again, and are even capable of being handed down from generation to generation. So learning how to deal with conflict is obviously very, very important, and it comes with a lot of self-awareness that pretty much none of us actually have the tools for unless we try to go out and find them. I did want to read how this author defines conflict resolution, just for the purposes of this discussion. So he says, I define conflict resolution as the process of creating harmony from discord. This means that conflict resolution encompasses everything from international mediation to an apologetic hug for your spouse. The word resolve comes from the Latin words re and solvere. To solve is to loosen, much as a solvent dissolves another substance. To resolve connotes a melting away, an untangling and untying. This is precisely what I believe needs to happen in an emotionally charged conflict. We need to loosen the toxic ties, to melt them away, paving the way for the natural ties of harmony that I believe underlie the human character. So another thing to note is that this author, slash, I believe he's a doctor as well, and a professor. He's at least a professor. I don't know if he's a doctor. Believes he is a doctor. Believes that people underneath are wanting to live in harmony. And there are a couple like kind of counter examples to that, but he just thinks that the natural state of things is a state of harmony. Doing well, thank you. And yeah, I agree that a lot of those popular discussions that are out there are definitely rooted in anger, and people are rarely trying to be diplomatic about those things for sure. So if we roll back a little bit, I was talking about the idea that identity is not necessarily fixed. And there's something called the fixed identity fallacy, which is this idea that identity is fixed, but obviously, as the name states, it's a fallacy. That's not actually true. So something that is worth thinking about is the fact that we narrate what's happening to us in real time. We react to things, we absorb things in a certain way. Somebody says something to us, and depending on our mood or what's on our mind or what's happened in our past or what we fear about the future, we can take their words and make them fit our narrative. And we don't even stop to think about how did they really mean those things most of the time, unless you've really sort of like trained yourself to do that. It's very difficult to just in the heat of the moment like take a minute and think, okay, number one, why is this upsetting me? Number two, did they really mean it that way? Like sometimes we can just be so convinced that the other person meant something a certain way. And I think that just increases the amount of tension between us and the other person. And probably all of you guys have gotten into this kind of situation before where you misinterpret or misunderstand or just really believe that someone meant something mean to you. And then so you get put on guard and you come after them and you're like, what the hell? And you get mad at them and that puts them on guard. So all of a sudden you guys are having a fight over what's essentially a miscommunication. And I think that when people often talk about the fact that we need to communicate better in relationships and across cultures and ethnicities and races and countries, I think that that's kind of like the heart of this issue. It's not just communication, it's understanding the other side and not jumping the gun and believing that you understand the other side right off the bat. So the interesting thing, I guess, about the fact that we're narrating as we go is that we're the subject and we're also the object. We are doing the analysis, but of ourselves. And so that can kind of lead to like a little bit of an echo chamber in our own head, like we believe what we believe, and then we're reading our own situations based on our beliefs, which feeds back into our beliefs, if that makes sense. So when he talks about the different parts of identity, he talks about core identity and then relational identity. So your core identity, he describes as a spectrum of characteristics that define an individual or a group. This can have things to do with your body, your personality, your occupation, your spiritual beliefs, your cultural beliefs, or your practices as a culture. It can also have to do with your personal preferences, your personality traits, and who you identify with in social groups. At the same time, you can have multiple social identities. So maybe some of you like relate to this. I know a lot of people in high school probably related to this, or maybe in college, I don't know. Some of the kids in high school were definitely a part of a group, right? Like you had the jocks, you had the stoners, you had the skaters, you had those kind of overlap sometimes. You had the goth kids, you had the like choir kids, you had the band geeks, you had whatever, right? And I say that affectionately. I was in band and choir, so and that just goes to show though is that sometimes you relate to multiple groups. So like the kids who I hung out with at lunch, Talon, Alan, and Matt, the three of them were my like stoner skater friends, and we ate lunch together every day. But I really didn't like see them much outside of that. Like we were thick as thieves, right? We loved the same music, we were into the same things. I couldn't skate as well as they could, but you know we dressed alike. It was all very good. We got along really, really well. But then at the same time, like come fourth period, I was in choir, and that was an all girls group. And I had my friends in there, and the things that we talked about, the way that we talked, the way that we interacted with one another, and the fact that we felt very rejected by the popular kids, that was my social identity come block four, you know? Completely different world than at lunchtime when I really didn't care about anyone else. I was just with my three buddies, and that was it. So if you guys can, yeah, you wear different hats depending on the social situation that you're in. And I think that this is different than being an amoeba. That's what I call it anyway, where like you don't have a sense of identity, so no matter what group you're with, you just kind of like mold to fit them. You pick up on their interests and their social cues, and you try to conform to them so that they'll like you. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about groups that you really feel some sort of connection with because you believe in the same morals or ethics, or you do something together as a group, like sing and compete and stuff like that. It's definitely not exactly the same as someone who's just like trying to fit in everywhere. And yeah, I think that's another good example is that you're not going to act the same around your friends or at your job as you would around your parents. Um, I haven't thought that way in a long time, but I can definitely remember how true that is. I would never be the same person that I was socially or at school or hang out with my friends. Like if I had been that person in front of my parents, that would have been probably got me in trouble, right? Because I cussed a lot earlier than I was supposed to, and I did drugs, and I hung out with, you know, all kinds of people I know my parents wouldn't approve of because they were very conservative and all that good stuff. So your core identity is has some mutability, but for the most part, these things are very deeply ingrained in you. So you have like an emotional stake in them. And he lists here the pillars of your core identity, which are very important to the sort of rest of the discussion. So he says that there are 5 total pillars. The first one is beliefs. And beliefs are your convictions, your principles, and your morals. So obviously you can start to see how important these things would be. Rituals include your meaningful customs and ceremonial acts, whether they're holidays, rites of passage, regular prayer, or just an evening dinner with the family. Rituals are very important too, at least in our society. You know, people try to keep their sort of culture, their family, their religion alive by participating in rituals. Number 3 are the allegiances, and these are the deep loyalties that you feel towards your family member, friend, authority figure, nation, tribe, ancestor, or any other person, place, or thing, whether real or mythical. So we all have like allegiances that we can believe in. Some of them are real, some of them are fictitious. Like when I played World of Warcraft, there was a huge divide between the Horde and the Alliance at the outset. And it was like kind of blasphemy to like cross those lines. You were either one or the other. And I think that we can see that a lot with allegiances. It's like people kind of feel like if you break an allegiance, you're like a piece of shit, right? Like no one wants to befriend someone who's going to turn their back on the people who they're supposed to be there for most. Usually allegiances are with, like it says, like family members or really good friends, people that would have your back too. So again, we can see how that's a huge pillar of identity. Number 4 are the values, and these represent your ideals, which can be explicit. And he says our nation values liberty and justice, or they can be embodied in a memorable narrative. And his example is, I remember hearing about how grandfather fought day and night for this land. So you can kind of think of this one too as like the things that you inherit from your ancestors that become important to you for whatever reason. So like most of my ancestors are from Ireland, and even though I've never even been to Ireland, I don't speak Gaelic, I don't have an Irish last name, I don't really have a lot other than being short and fair and having blue eyes, blue hair. There are traits about me that are definitely from Ireland, but I was not there when all of the conflict that drove my ancestors out of Ireland was happening. At the same time, when I watched a video that was depicting some of the most horrific things that happened in Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the like bombings and just like awful bloodshed and really sneaky tactics and terrible things that happened, it made me like physically ill. I left class that day when I was studying and learning about that stuff because I was just like disgusted, I guess. And it was also like kind of attacking my values. Like I felt badly for the people who had come before me, the people who had to flee and come through Ellis Island and try to start a new life where everyone in America didn't even want them. They hated them, right? Because they were immigrants, just like any other immigrants. So that would be kind of something I would think of about that, is like, I need to be proud. I have to have a value for the fact that I'm here in America because my ancestors went through something terrible in order to provide a better life for their lineage, right? For number 5, it's emotionally meaningful experiences. And he says these can be intense events, positive or negative, that define a part of your identity. They comprise everything from the day you got married to the hour your first child was born, the moment your parents slapped you, to the memory of mass violence conducted against your group. So you can kind of see how some of the 5 pillars of identity are like personal, and other ones have to do with your wider community, your group, the people who you relate to. I did have blue hair at one point. I don't think that these are in any order of importance. They are all 5 pillars, just what make up the idea of your core identity. And again, these are the ones that have some mutability, but mainly are kind of so deeply ingrained in you that you're not really willing to let them go unless you kind of have to. And then the second type of identity is the relational identity. And this is the spectrum of characteristics that define your relationship with a particular person or group. Sorry if some of this seems really abstract right now, but I promise it's all going to come back down and make a lot more sense in a more narrow view. So essentially, like as the name sort of suggests, your core identity is inside of you. Your relational identity has to do with the way that you relate to other people and the way that you perceive them relating to you. And 10 points for anyone who can remember where this connection versus rejection thing, like what did we talk about, that has to do with. That didn't make any sense. We had a discussion that was discussing a topic that really heavily hinged on whether or not you are accepted or rejected by others. I don't know if anyone's going to remember, but I'll give that a second. Self-esteem, yay! Thank you. Okay, 10 points. So self-esteem is all bundled into this as well. And as we know, we seek meaning in our existence. We also seek meaning in our coexistence with other people. And these things change constantly, so we have a huge power to reshape them, whereas our core identity, not so much. So how we perceive others and then how we think that they perceive us has to do a lot with our self-esteem, right? And what we know about self-esteem is that it can really, really impact our mood and how we value ourselves as people. We can start to think of ourselves as really worthless and shitty people if other people are not accepting us, right? So a lot of the times these relations are kind of more abstract. It's kind of more of like a feeling. Like when my incident with Schmeg happened and I was rejected from the group sleepover, right? It wasn't like I really knew why that hurt so bad. I mean, I did, but it was like mainly I had feelings. I didn't have thoughts about it. I wasn't like thinking rationally or irrationally about why that happened. I just felt sad and lonely and embarrassed, and kind of ashamed to be myself. And so you can see how those things are kind of more abstract. It's not like having just a characteristic to rely upon, like, oh, my personality or, my choir group or my lunch friends or whatever. It's more just like I get a feeling that someone doesn't like me, or I get a feeling that I don't like someone else, or I get a feeling that someone else doesn't like me. It's not as fixed. Fucking schmag, dude. So the opposite, so there's affiliation with other people, which is like our emotional connection to them, and then of course the opposite is rejection. And I thought it was interesting that in this book he notes that rejection is felt in the anterior cingulate cortex area of our brain, which is the same area that processes physical pain. I thought that was very, very interesting. Like, when we feel rejected, it's literally the equivalent of a physical pain to our brain. So it sends these, signals to our body that we're hurt. And I don't know about you guys, and I don't know if anyone would ever want to admit this, but I have been in a place where I was so sad and crying so hard that I felt in physical pain. I've been heartbroken to the point where my chest hurt and my stomach hurt, and I just felt like I had been, they say like, oh, you feel like you got punched in the gut or something. Like, there's a reason for that. It's because your brain is actually sending signals that you're physically wounded in those situations. Yeah, it can literally take your breath away, and to the point where you're like, you cannot breathe, you cannot feel calm, like you feel like you got the shit beat out of you essentially, over emotions. So that's another reason not to diminish other people's emotions, is because they really don't feel good. Like, that's a very real thing. So then we also have autonomy, of course, which is our ability to exercise our own free will. And there's argument about that. Some people believe that we have zero free will as human beings, and I don't know how I feel about that, so I'm not going to really comment on it. I've thought about it. I don't really know what my stance is, and I don't know that there's any way to truly find out. So under the assumption that we do have free will, autonomy is very important to us, and we don't like being told what to do. I have issues with authority. At the same time, I cannot relate to people who say that, like if I go and tell my friend, like, hey, can you wash your car? And they were about to wash their car. This is what these people always say, that they're about to do the thing, and then someone comes and tells them to do the thing, and then they're irritated, so they don't want to do the thing anymore. Like, it bothers them so much to be told what to do that even if they were literally about to do that thing, they'll cancel and be like, nah, I'm not doing that thing anymore because I'm annoyed that someone told me what to do. To me, it is an odd defiance, but I've met a lot of people that really do feel that way, so I can't discount it as just like a weird thing. It like really, really bothers some people. And at the same time, I have things about authority that really bother me that I'm sure wouldn't be a big deal to other people. For example, when I was growing up, my older brother and I used to actually get into fights because I would be questioning why our parents were making us do something that didn't make sense to me or wasn't fair to me, and he would be like, would you just shut the fuck up and like do it? Like, why do you have to fight them all the time? And I would be like, why are you such a pushover? Like, what do you mean? Like, they're making us do all these things that make no sense whatsoever. We're being used, we're being manipulated, we're being treated like garbage, and you don't care. So I would always look at him and think, like, you're weak and you have no spine. And he would look at me and think, you're hard-headed and I cannot stand the fact that you always have to speak up. Yeah, like Jet says. So, like, some people just are like, don't you tell me to do something. I'm not going to do it after you tell me. And that's a really good thing that you're saying there, Vince, is like maybe their intelligence felt insulted. And I'm coming around to that here soon. I'm sorry that this preamble is so long. I can't believe it's almost been an hour already, but the best thing that we're looking for in conflict resolution is to find a medium between affiliation, our sense of getting along with other people, and autonomy. We want to be able to be ourselves to a degree, but we also want to be amicable to a degree. And so being able to feel those things at the same time is, in a sense, harmony. But of course, as we're kind of talking about, it's very complicated. Like, it's not just as easy as being like, oh yeah, you're right, I'm going to live my life completely differently now. Yeah, I think it is going to have to be a three-parter. And that's interesting, Jet, that you say that acting like that stunted you, because I feel like these things are stunting us all, and it's just sometimes we can like realize it, and sometimes we really, really can't. There was also something here from Confucius, who... Do I know a lot about Confucius? Absolutely not. But I thought that this was at least interesting, if I can find it. I said that it's on page 24. I'm looking at page 24. Should have put a flag. Maybe I wrote the wrong page number. Okay, dope. I don't know exactly where that went, but that's cool. I'll figure it out later and maybe bring it back up next time. So essentially we all have to have like a much more open mindset if we're ever going to avoid what this author calls the tribes effect. TRIBES space EFFECT, the tribes effect. The experiment that I sort of told you guys about, where they all have to, I'm so sorry, I'm a tear, where they all have to sit in this room and decide on essentially a new like world principle. The effect that is happening within each of those coalitions, as I called them earlier, is the tribe effect. People become absorbed in their tribe and their tribe's mentality, and it becomes very, very difficult to break away from that, even if you've only been a part of the tribe for an hour. You just stand for it. And there are evolutionary reasons why we do these things, but of course, in a modern world, they're not always useful, and they can actually end up backfiring and becoming incredibly unuseful to us, and hurt our relationships with other people. So the tribe's effect makes us adversarial, so we're like pitted against an enemy. It makes us self-righteous. We believe that our ideas are better than our enemy's ideas. And it makes us closed-minded, to where we're unwilling to accept the other person's, or not even accept, but just listen to the other person's side. And again, the easiest one for me to like just say off the top of my head is politics. When you're on one side of the fence or the other, it's very, very easy to just blanket. I mean, how many of you here, if you want to say, have seen a bumper sticker about something and just gotten really, really mad, right? Like, I was driving behind this truck the other day coming home, that had a lot of bumper stickers that I had a visceral reaction to. I just, based on their car and their bumper stickers, I felt like I knew them and like I knew what they stood for, and it's very much not the same things that I stand for. And so it irritated me. Like, it made me angry and made me think about, like spitting in their face. Not really, but just, it really infuriated me to see these bumper stickers. And yeah, that blanket statement tags, that's pretty much how it goes. But at the same time, I have a friend who we never talked about political stuff, religious stuff, any of our like beliefs before we really started becoming friends. We built our friendship on other things. We built our friendship on getting along and enjoying the same things and other things that still exist within everyone, right? Come to find out that this person has extremely different views than I do when it comes to things like religion and politics, like hot button issues, abortion, all of that stuff that I feel one way about. This person feels pretty much the exact opposite about. But since we were already friends, I don't care. Like, I magically don't care. I still don't agree with him most of the time, all the time on these things, but I don't think less of him for it. I don't look down on him, and I'm not willing to sacrifice our friendship over those things. Like, I care about him as a person, and I see that he is just more than just those beliefs. But when we're looking at just the bumper sticker in the truck, or the, bumper sticker in the car, or the whatever, like, or we see someone, like around here where I live, there's a lot of people who fly the rebel flag, and to me, that just, I automatically see that, and I think that person's a racist. That person doesn't like black people, and therefore I don't like them. Is that 100% of the time the case? No. I know that there are people out there who fly the rebel flag because it's a part of their ancestral values. They feel like they are doing a disservice to their ancestors by erasing that part of history, even though they can agree that it wasn't good. I can't really relate to that, but at the same time, I'm like, okay, like, we're all different. We all have the things that we are going to stand up for and believe in. The important part is that we can still associate with other people, still listen to them, still get along with people just because they have one or two ideas that we don't agree with. when I think about this, I think about the fact that, like, I consider myself to be incredibly complex, right? Like, when I have thoughts and feelings, I'm like, man, I think all the time. I have all these weird quirks. There are things about me that are like, I don't even understand. But then when I think about other people, I really simplify them sometimes. And I'm just like, this person's a dud. This person does this person, whatever. Like, this person's IQ is low, like, whatever. And I think it's just really, really easy to do that, especially if it's a person that either we don't know at all or someone that we've known for a really long time. And one of the people in this, the author of this book quotes a guy who says that it goes from an I and thou relationship, like me and you, to an I and it relationship. And for any of you out there who ever had to take an English class, you probably know that there's this thing called the savage it that has cropped up in literature, especially when it comes to like the colonization of anything by Europe, essentially, especially in areas with people of color, of any kind of color, because the European colonizers very much believed that they were above these other people, better than them. They would judge them by their society or their beliefs or the way that they did things. And these people became it. They were not human to them. They were savages. And there was like a huge divide between being a person and being an it. And we kind of disintegrate into this mentality when we look at something just like a bumper sticker, like I did, and be like, this person's a piece of trash, right? Like, I wouldn't, walk into the same bar with this fool. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this person. It's very, it's just visceral, and it just matters a lot. It's very, very ingrained. It's part of your core identity that's being bothered by this thing. And so you can literally take a human who's super complex and reduce them to a savage, where you just don't see them as like a human being. So we tend to feel like morally superior. We believe that we don't want to be disloyal to our own identity, and that becomes like a huge part of this narrative. It's essentially a threat response whenever we get into a conflict, okay? So Freud called this the narcissism of minor differences. And I think that's really important because a lot of times when we're in conflict, we see these differences as being colossal and insurmountable and just things that we could never change. And yet, from the outside, you might realize that these are not that big of a deal type things. Like, how are you acting so terrible towards another human being over something that's like really not that big of a deal? And this is again when a lot of people are like, wow, this person must be having like a really bad day, or this person must be like really sad and pathetic and have nothing going on in their life to get so upset. But I don't really think that that's the full story. The thing is that there are whenever those pillars of our identity are being threatened, that's when we react in a certain way. And I don't think that we can always see that in the moment. We don't always know why we feel the way that we feel. We just know that it's like really making us feel something to see or hear or whatever. And not to say that there aren't like some truly disgusting things that people say and do. There are. Some people are just the scum of the earth, and they're irredeemable in my opinion. Like, unless they completely change and redeem themselves literally, I think people do deserve like second chances and all that. But if someone does or says something that's just like really despicable, I'm not saying that that's okay whatsoever. But in general conflict that you might get into with the people in your life or on your Facebook or whatever, typically speaking, one or the other, or probably both parties, are feeling like a part of their identity is being threatened. And that's a big deal to us. It doesn't feel good to feel like, uh-oh, my world is about to change. And you see this really simplified, and just, this is the times that, like, sometimes I get really, really embarrassed of other white people, because they'll say things like about Hispanic folks, like, this kind of thing just bothers me. It's like so simplified, acting like Spanish people are doing this, that, or the other thing that is going to threaten them. So they're like, oh, they're taking all of our jobs. And I'm like, what? Like, what's really bothering you? Because I don't see many white people who are trying to go into the same industries that are being offered to people who are working their way up like that. Like, they're not stealing our jobs. We need people to fulfill some of these occupations, and I don't think that it's cool either to, like, shit on people for having a different occupation than you. People want all of their goods and commodities like this, but they don't treat people who work in those industries as human beings, and that's just, like, crazy to me. So it bothers me when there are these, like, blanket statements. And then, of course, through social media and stuff, they get popularized so much. And then it's like, you have one tribe who's like, yeah, rabble, 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 Spanish people can't come here because they're fucking up our country, and, whatever, they're taking our job. Right? And then you have the other people on the other side that are, like, really upset at those people, because they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, why is this bothering you so much? And instead of asking that, really, they kind of just say, like, y'all are stupid. Like, you're not making a good point. And then it just becomes a clash between these two groups, when really it just started off that these people are feeling threatened. And I think that a lot of times these people don't have the tools to consider why they're feeling threatened, or maybe even to recognize that they are feeling threatened. So there are lures. Okay, hopefully I wrote down the right page number. Yeah, I did. These are called the 5 lures of the tribal mind. So remember, the tribe effect is this idea that we're all in our own camp, and we have to be kind of like allied with that camp. So the first one is called vertigo, and this is a warped state of consciousness in which a relationship consumes your emotional energies. And I'm going to actually go in depth about each of these after I say them all out loud. So if you're confused, don't worry. Number 2 is called the repetition compulsion, and it's a self-defeating pattern of behavior that you feel driven to repeat. Number 3 are taboos, and they are social prohibitions that hinder cooperative relations. And then 4 and 5, I don't think we'll have time for, but I'll go over them next time probably. 4 is called an assault on the sacred, which is an attack on the most meaningful pillars of your identity that we talked about before. And then number 5 is identity politics, the manipulation of your identity for another person's political benefit. So these are lures, and they act like sirens. If you guys have ever read some literature that has a siren and you know what they are, they're essentially like sea women who would sing a beautiful song that lures sailors to their island, where they will then shipwreck and die, or in some way become tortured by these women who are seemingly so wonderful. So these lures towards the tribal mind effect can be incredibly strong and powerful, and also can happen without us really noticing, right? A lot of the sailors who get sucked in towards the sirens only do so because they don't know what's really happening. They just hear the beautiful song and they just kind of like drift towards that thing. And it's similar when you're dealing with falling into conflict patterns. the author also like compared this to in Star Wars, like the light side versus the dark side. The light side is the area where we're able to discuss these things and like have a healthy conversation, and then the dark side would be obviously where we are succumbed to our patterns and beliefs that we feel are immutable, and we look at other people as savages. So we need to not like ignore the common ground that we have with other human beings, and we also need to be able to see them as complex individuals rather than just one thought or one sentence, one communication that they make that we don't agree with, and so on. So the first thing is vertigo, and this one was like one of the most interesting to me. So this is when your mind becomes warped and the issue that you're dealing with is completely all-consuming of your emotional energy. It's kind of like a poison, and it makes it really hard for you to see inside of yourself, and instead you just kind of have a warped sense of reality, almost like physical vertigo, but for the emotions. It becomes very, very hard to self-reflect when you're in this state because you're typically swept away by your emotions. The author compared it to like being in a tornado, and the only thing you can see when you look up is everything that you fear, and then swirling all around you is your emotions. So you're kind of like trapped in this very claustrophobic space, feeling like you kind of don't have a way out. And this can kind of force us to, or this can be a side effect or a symptom of reenacting what are called conflict scripts. So if any of you have had a long-term relationship with a family member, friend, or loved one in some way, you know that if you fight, I guess I should say, with this person over and over again, even if it's once a year, you might notice that you kind of fall into the same conflict script, almost like it's predestined. And there's a huge reason for that. It's easy to get back into this also without really noticing that it's happening. We also become less capable of having self-conscious feelings when we're in this state. So we might not feel guilt or shame for our emotions like we usually would. For example, I can remember when I was young and when I would first get angry towards my mom, I would yell something or get really, really angry and storm up to my room, and then 10 minutes later, when I calmed down, I would be so overcome with guilt for having been mean that I would just start crying, like sobbing. I was so sad and felt so terrible that I had treated someone that way, especially someone that I loved so much. It made me feel ashamed and very, very guilty. And the first thing I would do is go apologize and, say I didn't mean it, that I was angry or whatever. We all kind of have probably experienced this at one point or another, whether we've done it to someone else or someone else has done it to us, and it doesn't feel good, right? But when we're in a state of vertigo and or we are repeating a conflict script, we tend to not have those feelings of guilt or feelings of embarrassment. So it is like a template for a fight. So I'll give an example from my own life that's really hard to discuss, but here goes. In my current relationship, I've kind of mentioned to some of you before, especially if you're my Patreon patrons, that things have become complicated, right? So there's a lot of reason for this, though, and a lot of it also has to play into this idea of vertigo. So early on in this relationship, something happened that was very hurtful towards me. It involved a lie and a couple other things that were really unsettling and made me think that this wasn't a good idea, to be in this relationship, that I couldn't trust this person, that I was just really, really hurt and humiliated in a way that I really had not been before. So since that happened, I had a choice to make, right? I believed that the reason why, after discussing it with him, I believed that the reason why this happened was truly out of cowardice, which was what he described. That he lied because he was too nervous to tell the truth, if that makes sense. So, I mean, a lot of the times that is why people lie, right? They're scared of the consequences. People also lie because they're hiding things, and that's another story, and you have to kind of distinguish, like when you catch someone in a lie, are they hiding something or are they just being a coward? And I had enough reason to truly believe that he was just being a coward, and I felt like, okay, it was a mistake. So being a person who can forgive and believe that people will have a second chance to prove themselves, I was like, okay, like, I'm on my guard, but I'm going to trust that you didn't do that intentionally to hurt me or because you were hiding something even worse, okay? So that was a decision that I made that completely altered the entire course of the relationship, based on a decision that he made that initially altered the course of the relationship. So from that moment forward, though, I had a very deep feeling that I couldn't trust this person. And it was on my mind all the time. I hated the way that it made me feel for all of that to happen. It was, like, honestly one of the most, like, horrific emotional feelings that I've had. So I was just constantly on guard from that moment out, feeling like I need to watch my back and I can't ever really feel comfortable around this person, which is not a good way to start a relationship. It's not good to build a foundation on no trust. But in my head, I was thinking that I could get over it and that, like, it wasn't gonna be a problem. Little to my knowledge, though, it continued to be a problem for a long time, because I then had an impression of what I believed about him. In my head, he became someone who was untrustworthy, who was a liar, who could potentially play around, who could do a lot of new things to hurt me. And obviously I didn't want to be hurt again, especially not twice by the same person, because then I would just feel like an idiot, right? So through this, I developed my own conflict script with him early on. And every single time something was even slightly off place, my brain would just go back to, like, okay, yeah, but that one time you lied, so you're probably lying again. To make matters worse, there were a number of subsequent lies based on the first lie that I found out kind of like over time. So obviously that just led me to feeling more and more like I can't trust this person. This person is a scuzzball. He's a snake, right? But at the same time, the logical, rational part of me was like, I do believe, though, that he was just being a coward. So when you have this kind of like discordance in your relationship, and you might see this with a family member, right? You want to love them because they're your family member. Like, it's your brother or it's your mother or it's your dad, whatever. And you have to kind of believe in your heart that they're there for you and that you have some common ground. But then at the same time, they could be doing things that really hurt you and make you feel like crap about yourself, or make you feel guilty or scared or bad. And you're like always just kind of like swinging back and forth between these two feelings of, I believe in them, but do I though? And that kind of can create this impression that you have about the other person that can lead to a world of trouble as things progress, right? So then any single time that something would happen in the relationship that I'm in, I just constantly would go back to feeling exactly as bad as I felt the very first time that something happened. And that stopped me from ever feeling guilty, from ever feeling ashamed of myself, from ever even accepting that maybe he has more feelings than that. I pigeonholed him into a corner of thinking that he was a no good fool. And even though I was still trying to make the relationship work and like on the day to day things were fine, if anything even kind of resembled a whiff of what had happened previously, I went straight back to feeling exactly like I had felt before. So, I guess apply that to your own kind of situation and sort of try to reflect on, do you have a relationship in your life where you kind of fall right back into the same feelings about the person? I can also say that this is something that has happened in a lot of my relationships when it comes to like being a team effort. If like, let's say with the person that I lived with in Virginia, who I've told you guys a few times now would never lift a finger around the house, wouldn't help with anything, right? Anytime that something would happen where he wouldn't help, it just made me think of him as like a lazy piece of shit. And I continued that, and then it built up these feelings inside of me of like, this person's a lazy piece of shit, he doesn't treat me right, he doesn't care about me. All of these offshoot feelings to like, he didn't put his socks in the laundry bin. Doesn't seem like a big issue, but the reaction that I would have to that issue would be massive, because I would be like, why are you always doing this? Like, why can't you just be a normal human being and pick up after yourself or like contribute? Or I started reading that as my own self-worth. I thought, certainly this person doesn't love me, doesn't want me, doesn't accept me the way that I feel about them, because they are not willing to do this thing. Meanwhile, there were probably a lot of things going on for this other person that were influencing why they weren't changing and why they weren't trying and why they weren't capable of doing these things. But I couldn't see that, and I just laid all the blame on them. And in retrospect, partially it was their fault and partially it was my fault. Like, there were, and I'm sure that it's the same thing like right now. Like, partially it's his fault, partially it's my fault. There are things that I've been unfair about, and there are things that he made bad decisions about. So we tend to stereotype people and then just see them in this one way, instead of remembering that they are complex and that they have other emotions. And that can be doubly difficult when we don't get to know what their sort of struggle is. For me, I kind of realized as I was writing these notes and reading that like my biggest, deepest fear, I guess, is that I am not wanted. And that stems very, very deeply from things that happened in my upbringing. Like my parents telling me when I was really young that they shouldn't have had kids, that they didn't like how having kids had affected their relationship, that they were happier before they had children. My dad has told me, like, even just the last time I talked to him, told me that he wishes that he had broken up with my mom in high school, and that he wishes that none of this had ever happened. So when you hear things like that, starting when you're like 7 or 8 years old, even though at the time I didn't consciously think, I didn't process it the way that I would say it now. What I would say now is that I don't feel ever like I'm wanted, no matter what relationship I'm in. If it's a friendship, if it's a romantic relationship, if it's whatever in a classroom, I always feel like I'm the odd man out. I always feel like the other person doesn't love me the way that I love them. And obviously that comes from a long history of feeling that way. It's not just about what's happening in this moment, but to me, it is. To me, I'm seeing the present and I'm thinking that all of these feelings are happening due to the present, when in reality, a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are coming from old feelings that happened a long time ago. And that is what happens to all of us. Maybe your problems are completely different than mine. Sometimes for people it's abandonment, a parent leaves, or they are an orphan, or a parent dies when they're young, or it could be social stuff. It could be stuff with brothers and sisters. It doesn't have to be a parental rejection like mine was. But every single person that you meet has their own version of that. And if you don't figure out what that is about the other person, that can be another, or maybe I should phrase it this way. Trying to learn what that thing is about the person who you're dealing with can open up a world of new conversation and understanding with that person. I still don't know what his thing is. I have tried to figure that out, but I've never directly asked because I didn't know to ask until literally reading this book. I just had never thought about that. I just always see the other people in my world as much more simple than they are. And it's not like a I'm better than you thing. It's just like I have my own narrative. And in my narrative, no one wants me. And all I'm looking for is like this ultimate love that I thought my parents were going to give me. I thought boyfriends were going to give me. I thought friends were going to give me. I'm just constantly seeking someone to love me with the intensity that I am capable of loving them. And I have not found that yet. I don't know if that's something that I'll ever find though. Like, I don't know if that's a reality or if that's just a product of me feeling very unwanted. So as you can see, it can get really, really complex really fast, and we might not really always know like why we feel so incredibly threatened, and we might not understand why the other person feels really threatened. As much as we might know them, you could live with someone for your entire life and never really know what internal traumas they have that are influencing the way that they see the world. So instead of seeking to discover other people's rational intentions, we try to confirm the other person's irrationality. So in the current case, instead of me trying to understand better why these things were happening in my relationship, I instead was just trying to prove that like he was a piece of shit. And obviously that had a strain on the relationship because I'm just sitting here being like never on his side, never taking his word, never really truly believing him or giving him a chance to show me who he actually is, because I just had it in my head that he was a certain way. And I knew logically that that's why the relationship continued, was because I knew logically that I was wrong in doing that. But it's just so deep-seated when you're trying to protect yourself, right? You kind of do whatever it takes to not feel rejected again and sad again. Nice pickup line. So we kind of look for like evidence to confirm the bad stuff, and we ignore the contradictions. In the case of people who don't help in the relationship, that can be like, oh, there he goes again, not throwing his trash away. And yet he could have thrown his trash away the last 3 days, and that just didn't even register for me because I am constantly just looking for the bad to confirm the fact that I think this person is a slob, or that they're lazy, or that they're never going to change, essentially. And we can kind of do the same thing with ourselves too, is like we almost force the issues that we're scared of to happen. Like, I'm so hell-bent on the fact that I'm unwanted that I kind of make people not want me after a while. Like I go from being wanted to like shoving them away kind of, because I just feel like that's what's going to happen in the end anyway, so what's the point? And it's kind of miserable to like do that over and over and over again, but it's really hard to learn not to do that, because in this state of vertigo, the tornado of emotions, there's only fear and your emotions. There's nothing else to ground you. Another thing that this does is kind of constricts your perception of time and space. So there are time warps, which essentially what happens, and you might be able to relate to this too, is like at the beginning of an argument, you're like hyper focused. But then as soon as the other person kind of hits the points that you consume as like evidence against your own case, you can really quickly lose track of time and end up having a really long fight. Like you end up fighting with someone for like 5 hours, and it just takes up the whole day going back and forth saying meaningless shit. And we see this all the time on Facebook threads and Reddit threads and stuff, right? People will spend their entire day arguing through their keyboard with someone else about a point that they're never going to change the other person's mind with their current tactic, but they just feel the need to continue and continue and continue arguing. The author used an example of a couple that he knew, husband and wife, who were in a furniture store or whatever, bedding store, and like the wife wanted to buy this quilt for the bed, and the husband was like, we don't need that quilt, we have a quilt, ours is fine. And she's like, it's falling apart, I really want this new flower quilt, like why are you being so stingy? And then that of course like infuriates him, and he's like, you know what, I don't even know why I married you in the first place. And like this is the exact kind of shit that my parents would do all the time, because they've been together for so damn long. It was just like immediately hopping from an argument about something so small. Like if you look back in 10 years, is a quilt really like the game changer in your relationship? Does it really matter that much? Probably not. But it goes from, I want this quilt, I don't want this quilt, you're stingy, I don't even know why I love you. And like, what the hell? It just becomes incredibly inflamed from what it could have been. And in that same fight that this couple had, they were in the store and they actually ended up like yelling at each other in public, and they were fighting for like 20 minutes, and they ended up being late for like a lunch date that they had with some friends at like a nearby restaurant, right? So that's the time warp situation that can happen when you're dealing with a situation of emotional vertigo. There are also spatial warps, which is like when the emotional space that we kind of talked about earlier between you and the other person is constricted. So if we always imagine that we have like a neutral space between us and the other person, like let's say you meet someone new and you don't particularly feel good or bad about them, there's probably not tension or really anything between you and the other person. There's just like a neutral energy field between you. But if this is someone that you argue with a lot, that space in between you becomes filled with all these negative feelings, and then you're kind of just constricted to this like angry space. Sometimes these can also be like absorbed by a third party. So if you've been online and you're reading someone else's inflammatory comments towards each other, you can then absorb those feelings of one side or the other or both, and you join into the argument because you've become irritated by their emotional energy. This also happens a lot, like in my childhood. This can happen a lot if you've grown up in a household with parents that are like constantly in conflict and just always fighting. That's how my parents were, and I was just a little sponge for all of that, and it upset me a lot to constantly be seeing that and like feeling their sadness and stuff. Like I would just cry for them. Sometimes it would be for my mom, sometimes it would be for my dad, sometimes it would be for both. It depended on the situation and what I thought of it, I guess. So it's really, really dangerous when you're dealing with this emotional vertigo, and you typically, like I said, can't really realize that you're inside of it. You become very, very fixated on the negative evidence that you have against the other person, and you can also become very haunted by past pains. And this is called chosen trauma. And that's where I kind of blame myself for the serious tension and depression that existed in this relationship for so long, because I chose to continue being traumatized by the initial like stuff that happened, instead of being able to let it go. After I was heard about how I felt, I hung on to it, and it just kept haunting me over and over again. I just couldn't get it out of my mind. I couldn't feel okay with it. Mentions of certain places or names that had to do with this situation, I just would be triggered in an instant, and just my whole mood would change. I would be inconsolable, unable to have a good time. It would ruin my entire day just to hear choice words. So that kind of sucked as well. And it was not just poisoning my life, it was, well, I should say it wasn't just poisoning his life, the mistake he made, it poisoned my life and made me very, very miserable. You can also do this with what are called memories of a feared future, which kind of seems weird to have like memories of the future, but sometimes you tell yourself something so many times that it's almost like it already happened. So like for me, I would just imagine like in this situation, imagine like he's gonna lie and or cheat, right? That would be my fears that I would have. And then I would just like make up these scenarios in my head. And thank God I'm as grounded as I am, because I can see how very quickly some girls become like the crazy bitch girlfriend, because you can really work yourself up thinking about like things that could happen in the future. I've made myself cry before thinking about things that didn't actually happen. Luckily, I'm not the kind of person that will turn around and then like explode on you because of something that didn't happen. Like if I have a nightmare and someone hurts me in the nightmare, I'm not going to turn around and be like, how dare you do that to me? Because I know that it's not true. It's fake. And luckily, I still had the presence of mind to understand that the things that I was daydreaming were fake, but it still influenced my present emotions a lot and made moving forward or forgiving truly or really building trust kind of an impossibility. This is the book title here, sorry. Negotiating the Non-negotiable, and good to see you, Spoona. I was always trying to be a mediator too, and it's definitely not a good thing when you're trying to be a mediator between other people in these situations, because there's just no winning. There's nothing you can really do. But with those memories of a feared future, they also become proof. Just like all the little negative things that happen become evidence that this person is the way you think they are, the things that you imagine them doing can also become your own proof that they are like a bad person, or that they're gonna hurt you in some way or whatever. And of course, who the hell wants to be hurt, right? So here are the symptoms of vertigo, or let me say, if you're trying to figure out whether or not you are suffering from emotional vertigo in a relationship with someone that you know. First of all, ask yourself, are you consumed by the conflict? When I was still in contact with my family, and also when this thing happened with this relationship, it was all I thought about. In the shower, as soon as I woke up, on the toilet, on the bus, in my car, listening to music, playing video games. It didn't matter what I was doing. In the background of my head, I was constantly having a fight with this person. It was or I was like rehashing things that happened and thinking to myself, why did that happen? How did that happen? What's going to happen next? What should I say? Like formulating my own defense or dwelling over things that happened between my parents and like wondering like, why did it go? I still do this actually with like my brothers. Like it fucks me up that my brothers don't talk to me. It makes me feel really, really terrible. And as much as I've tried to remind myself that most likely my parents are pitting them against me intentionally and they don't really know any better, I guess, it still hurts me on such a deep level that these boys who I gave my entire life to and tried to be there for every waking moment, just don't even talk to me. They don't think about me. They don't text me happy birthday. They don't text me Merry Christmas. They don't care seemingly about me at all. It's like I've been completely erased from my family's life. All 5 of them. None of them care about me. None of them want anything to do with me. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but my godparents were actually also included in this blowout to a point. I looked to them for help with my emotional struggles, and they completely rejected me and said that they literally said they didn't want to go tit for tat because it would be pointless. So they were going to stay out of it and didn't want to like discuss it. When I was like crying to them because I have text messages that my parents are telling me that they're like hitting each other and punching each other and dealing with all this crap, right? So I looked to them for help. They completely rejected me, did not want to help to this day. And because of all of that, now I feel like all 5 members of my family plus my godparents, none of them want to have anything to do with me. And part of me is okay with that, but part of me with my brothers, I'm still consumed by it. I still sit here and wonder, like, what are they thinking? What do they think about me? Why do they hate me so much? Why are they unwilling to talk to me? Are they ever going to come back around? Or have I lost them forever? So if you're consumed like that by any sort of conflict, you are probably in a state of emotional vertigo. I still have to figure that out for myself with this particular situation. Sometimes I hope that they would see my videos, but I know that they won't. So then I just kind of shut that down and think that I don't know how they would ever really know how I feel about them. They don't really have any way to know other than if they can take a second to look back and see how I treated them and how I was there for them. But they're boys. They might not do that. And if my parents are doing as good of a job as they usually do of like manipulating the situation, then I doubt that they will break away from that and ever really think about me again. So I would love for them to know that I love them and care about them, but I just don't see that happening. Number 2 is ask yourself, do you view the other as an adversary? So do you see that person as your enemy? In the case with this relationship, absolutely. I was constantly thinking like that my partner is my enemy who's out to get me and is going to hurt me again. Number 3, are you fixated on the negative? And that was definitely like a case in all of these situations. Like I was constantly fixated on the bad stuff and never really accepting the good stuff. And I think I still am doing that definitely in this relationship. Part of what still makes it very, very complicated for me is that I don't often believe the things that he says, even when they're like really nice and potentially very, very heartfelt. It's hard for me to see him that way. So it's hard for me to accept those feelings, which I'm sure is incredibly frustrating for him because obviously he wouldn't have stuck around this long if he didn't actually mean it. he's not really gaining a whole lot from me in terms of like mooching. Like, if anything, it would be the other way around. He does a lot more for me in like tangible terms than I do for him, in terms of like finances and other things that people could look at and say like, oh, he's using you. Like, I don't get that impression whatsoever. So part of me has to know logically that for some reason he does care, but and then I just say like, for some reason. I mean, like, I can't fathom it, because I still see him, I guess, as someone who hurt me. Um, so ways to kind of like break out of this, I guess. Number one, to recognize the pattern and recognize that this is even happening in your life. Because, like I said, vertigo is very, very difficult to realize when you're in it. There are a lot of layers to unpack. The second thing is to stop and slow down. So after you recognize your pattern or your thoughts that are constantly going in this direction, you have to stop and try to process them a little bit better and consider what you're really thinking and who you're thinking it about. There's also the, I guess, strategy of naming it, essentially. So, like, let's say that me and my partner are getting into a fight. You can say something like, I feel like we are slipping into vertigo. Do we really want to spend all afternoon fighting? And then when you put it out there like that, it's not really accusatory. It's not really like putting the other person down or whatever. You're just kind of like acknowledging the fact that like we're falling into our conflict script. We usually don't get anywhere with this. And then kind of asking like, is this fight worth it almost? You know, like, are we really arguing about something that matters? Or are we arguing about something because it's triggering towards something that happened in the past or something that we're fearful of happening in the future? Another thing to do is, like, if you're having these conflicts over and over with someone, is to take a break. As I mentioned earlier, whenever I would have a tantrum when I was a kid and like say things to my family that I regretted eventually, after I took a break from that situation and calmed down, I could see things with a lot more clarity. It's a different perspective. It's so easy to get sucked up into the moment and get upset. And especially nowadays that we have such instant communication, even with people who are not in front of us, we can fight back in an instant without contemplating what we're saying or what we're doing. Another thing we can do is to jolt the relationship, is what it's called. So, number one, remember your purpose. Ask yourself, like, what is the point of this conflict? If you're having a constructive discussion with someone, there should be a point. If you're having a conflict with someone, there's probably not a point, right? But there can be a constructive conflict, I guess, that I like to call just a conversation, where you have a purpose and you kind of have to stick to it. You might also want to refer to it as like a goal. Like, what's the goal of this discussion? And every time things kind of start fading into other feelings, you just kind of remember, like, okay, what is the goal of this discussion? Why are we talking about this? Another thing to do to give the relationship a jolt is to surprise them out of the script. So if it's typical for you to just continue with the escalation of the situation, try doing something different, like empathizing with them, understanding their point of view, apologizing for something that wouldn't be typical of you, something that doesn't continue the cycle, I guess. And you might think to yourself, like, well, I don't want to do those things. But if you can really recognize that this is an unhealthy behavioral pattern and it's toxic and it's like ruining the relationship, then odds are you'll be able to get to a point where you want to stop the conflict. You don't want to keep fighting, so you want to change it. And that's an option for you, is to just, instead of continuing on, ask them how they feel or tell them that you're sorry, like, I can understand how you feel that way, and let's talk about that. Um, Another thing you can do is to call in a mutually respected authority. This one and the last one, which is change the subject. I have a few concerns about these strategies of jolting the relationship. I think that a mutually respected authority is hard to find a lot of the times. With my parents, I was constantly begging them to go to therapy, and they didn't want to. Well, my dad specifically didn't want to because he felt like the therapist was going to gang up on him. He didn't want someone else to be taking sides against him. So, ideally, if both people are sane enough, you can use a well-respected therapist or a pastor, priest, or if it's a money issue, you can use a financial advisor. If it's a political issue, maybe you talk only in front of someone who can help mediate that conversation and keep things on track. In my experience, though, it's kind of hard to find a mutual authority because humans are going to want someone to agree with them, right? You're going to look to that person and be like, right, am I right? She's crazy, right? I just think it's really hard to find a mediator unless it's a financial thing, or if there's a kid involved, if you're going through a divorce and you need to put the child first. That's kind of a little bit easier because you have a really, really concrete goal that you both agree upon that underlies the whole situation. And then the other one is change the subject, and I just think that this has to be done with a lot of tact. Because I know for a fact that if I'm sitting here arguing with someone and then they just start trying to talk about pie, I'm intrigued because I love pie, but at the same time, I'm gonna be like, what the hell? Don't run away from this. Don't sweep this under the rug. I'm trying to talk to you here, That can just make someone more mad. So they are options, but I think that they should be used tactfully and only in the case that you know that you're not going to be inflaming the situation more or giving someone more proof or evidence that you are whatever they think you are, or vice versa. Suspicious Minds is a great song, by the way. Another thing that you can do is to expand your field of vision. So as we talked about, vertigo constricts you. You're in the time warp, you're in the space warp, you're in the tornado, you're just stuck in the middle. Something you can do is to alter the physical environment. For example, one of the fights that happened after the initial problem in this relationship took place in the bedroom. And until I rearranged the space, moved the bed and moved everything around, I never felt good going into that room. And sometimes people need to do this, if they've lived with someone for a long time and then they get divorced, it's they kind of have to start fresh and get a new house, a new space. Or maybe you're dealing with an argument and you're let's take a time out and let's go to the coffee shop or something, or let's go walk in the park as we continue to talk about this. There are a lot of ways to alter the environment, and that can greatly reduce the stress and tension. You can also adapt a new vantage point that's kind of broader. So instead of just always thinking about your same narrative over and over, you can try to look at the bigger picture. Try to he described it, I think, as flying out to the moon and looking down at Earth. And apparently there's some sort of phenomena too for people who do go to the moon, that when they look back down, or when they come back down to the Earth, earthly discord kind of just seems between people, between tribes, seems kind of really silly to them. They're more concerned as the Earth as a whole, and they can't get as caught up in the smaller problems. So kind of zooming out from the problem, I guess, and looking at it from a different vantage point. Like I was saying earlier, is a quilt really going to matter in 5 or 10 years? Is it that big of a deal? You can also play with time in these situations. You can slow things down, like I said earlier, or you can fast forward, like I just said, and see, is this going to matter in a long time? Or you can rewind to happiness. A really good thing to do in a relationship kind of issue is to go back to how it started and like what that felt like in the beginning. Remember the things that you connected with this person about, whether it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, it can be any relationship. Just thinking about how y'all bonded initially, what that felt like. Removing everything that has happened ever since then can kind of help you gain perspective. And again, not that you should sit here and think that like people deserve infinite chances. They don't. And after a certain period of time, usually you can tell that you're not respecting yourself, that you're letting someone walk all over you or manipulate you or whatever. And that's kind of another situation. But I just mean like, if this situation is something that you want to work through or that you think is worth working through, it can be helpful to just gain some perspective and get those like happy endorphins going, and then reflect on whatever the situation is. You can also put a clock on your venting. So even though this is kind of like unnatural seeming, you can set a timer and be like, we're going to argue for 1 hour. And when this hour is over, like we've said what we need to say and we're going to move on with our day. Or there was like a couple in this book who, one was like a staunch Democrat and one was a staunch Republican, but they were married, and they never really agreed on these things, but they agreed that only on Tuesday nights they would talk about politics. Every other time of the week, it was a taboo subject, and if you brought it up, you had to deal with the other person, your spouse, being mad at you, and you kind of had to feel that shame of broaching a situation or a topic that was off limits. So that's another interesting thing that you can do that has, I mean, I've used it before in past relationships, and it actually does work very well. Even though it seems like it would be difficult, it's really not that hard, because you kind of tell yourself ahead of time, like, this is all I get, and that can help you from just like arguing endlessly for like hours and hours about something. Finally, you can externalize the negative that you're feeling. So this is like symbolic communication instead of speaking about emotions directly. And the author uses an example of his son who was feeling distressed in his relationship with his brothers, feeling excluded, and he asked him to not name the actual feeling, like anger or sadness or whatever, but name the kind of more general, abstract feeling. And of course they're Star Wars fans, so his kid was like, it's the dark side. So like whenever he got this urge to like act out against his brothers, he started to see that as the dark side, like a force that was drawing him to do that thing and making him feel mad or sad or whatever. But he didn't have to identify the emotions. He just had to recognize that this pull was drawing him towards those feelings. And then you can kind of talk about things without making statements that are going to upset the other person, and you also don't have to really understand all of your emotions at that point. This is also a way that you can like strategize against your emotions. So the kid would like recognize that this dark side thing was happening to him, and then he would try to fight it, like mentally, I guess, but he envisioned himself with like a lightsaber kind of like fighting away the dark side, right? So maybe that's not exactly the way that you'll do it, but maybe it is. Essentially, it's just like name the general feeling, and then it's the feeling that makes you do something, that makes you argue, that makes you feel a certain way, that makes you say something that you don't want to say, whatever. The feeling that I'm having right now is irritation because my dog is sitting outside of the door whining, and I don't know why he's not in a different room where he can't do that, and it's just so irritating to me. But I'm going to fight that and be cool with it, and yeah, that's just kind of what you do, is resist the pull of the emotional tornado. So I guess that's kind of a good place to stop, because the next portion is talking about the repetition compulsion, which is another one of the kind of things that can happen that gets you stuck in a cycle of conflict. And I'm sorry that I didn't do a great job of interacting with chat. I've been worried about getting all this information out because, like I said, it's a lot. If anyone has any questions or comments that they wanted to say now, I can definitely focus on that and do my best to try to answer, whether it's based on something I said or just a different feeling. Yeah, it's definitely just irritating. I love him, but holy crap. He's just being a brat for no reason. And I am glad that you guys can't hear it, so thank you for saying that. Yeah, so I hope that this was at least a start to being helpful about conflict. I think that the main takeaways, I guess, are just that when people are reacting and perpetuating conflict, it's typically because it's built on fear, right? It's like a part of themselves, their identity that we talked about earlier, whether that's a core identity or an identity between people, is being attacked in some way in their mind. They might be fulfilling an old feeling, like for me, I'm not wanted, so that starts perpetuating in the relationship. These are just kind of like triggers that you might feel. And then vertigo is one of the sort of symptoms of conflict that can really characterize it. And then, of course, there are other ones that we'll talk about next time and deal with at that point. Thanks so much, Sawyer. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know it's a lot to talk about, but... And it can really, really be a self-fulfilling prophecy, absolutely. Like, you're scared of something happening, so you kind of, like, make it happen. You don't necessarily want that thing to happen, but... Like, one of the people in the book was, like, fearful of abandonment, so every time that her husband would go away on a business trip, whenever he would come back, she would just, like, blow up at him because she was feeling lonely and abandoned while he was gone. And she kind of had to rewrite her narrative to say, he's doing this for the family. He's not actually abandoning me. I have not heard of that, but I'm definitely going to write it down because I really enjoy reading about this kind of stuff. And I think that we all should kind of read more about it. Even if you're not willing to read a whole book, it's still good to like look up some articles and start accepting responsibility, I guess, for the things that happen, because whether or not we want to believe it, we're going to have these patterns just recur. It doesn't matter who's in our life. They might play out a little bit differently, but our portion is forever going to be the same unless we can realize and accept, like, I have a trust issue, I have a abandonment issue, I have a fear issue, whatever that is. And I actually had a list coming up in a couple pages of notes. Abandoned, alienated, dependent, emasculated, empty, enmeshed, helpless, inferior, insignificant, patronized, powerless, rejected, subordinate, used, weak, or worthless. Those are all kind of like fears that we can have that are going to write our own emotional narrative and influence the way that we act with other people. Mistakes were made, but not by me. So it's definitely important to deal with our own stuff first, I guess, before we try to always pit things on other people. And also, just if we ever want our life and the quality of our relationships to improve, we definitely all have to be doing our own work and be able to also acknowledge when other people need to do work. It's definitely a two-way street, but there's a lot to do. No, actually, all of these concepts, the question was, is the concept of vertigo only related to interpersonal conflicts? And all of the different things that I'll continue going through, all of the symptoms, I guess I'll call them, or he called them the lures towards conflict, they work on macro and micro levels. So, like in the case of some of the ambassadors and different international leaders that this guy was working with, they often had these feelings and stereotypes about the other that would completely stop them from even talking to the other side. It's definitely it's in between communities. I mean, I see this all the time, like especially around here between white and black people in the South. Like, so, I would say most people I run into are like pretty chill, honestly. But there are some people I've run into who definitely both ways are racist. It's not just white people hating on black people. Sometimes black people are taught to hate on white people too, because there's a fear. There's like from both sides. Both sides feel threatened. Their sense of self or rejection versus acceptance, all that kind of stuff, and some of it is obviously rooted in very real things, and there are still people who are acting just a fool these days, but a lot of it is born out of old narratives. I guess I don't have enough education to agree or disagree with that statement. I'm under the impression that all people can be racist, because I don't think that racism is confined to any particular ethnicity or race. Like, for example, when I first became friends with my friend Michelle, who is Japanese American, she taught me a lot about how racist different Asian cultures can be towards one another, and like the fact that she was not allowed to like date or be with like Vietnamese people. Like, it was like a huge deal. So I think that, in my opinion, which like I said, I'm not super educated on this, I think that everyone can be racist to other people, but I am not in any way trying to say that everyone has the same cultural past whatsoever. And yeah, communication is definitely befuddled, or I guess made more complex by like what people's definition of certain things are. Um, if my family saw my streams, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that they would be able to watch, because I feel like it would upset them a lot that I have used situations that I've seen. I'm not using them, and I'm not using what has happened to me in any way, but as examples from my own life, I talk about these things because they bother me. I don't talk about them in a malicious way, and I would hope that they would know that. I talk about them because like these are things that have hurt me, that I haven't been able to get across to them as hard as I tried to express to them how I felt at the time, like for years and years and years of me trying to plead with them and show them a different side, or just have them accept me and not tell me that I'm wrong all the time. Also, like, to have the loyalty and allegiance of my brothers would just be huge. because I feel like I would have done anything for them. And if they had come to me with a similar problem, I definitely would have listened to them and taken them seriously and tried to help them in any way possible. But I also just think that it would hurt. They would take it the wrong way. I feel like if they saw this stuff, I think they would assume that I was just talking shit about them and like trying to make them look bad, which is not the case. No one wanted those relationships to work out more than me. No one put more effort into trying to make them work and also trying to recognize what I was doing wrong. I was constantly trying to figure out how I was the problem because I always felt like I was the problem. So it wasn't just a blame game in my eyes. It was like really trying to figure it out and fix it because I just really wanted to fix it. I just don't think that they're on that page, personally. So yeah, I guess if no one has any more questions, I don't want to keep ruining anyone's sleep. I think that next month I'm going to move the streams like a half an hour forward if it works for my moderator, because I just feel really terrible that I'm messing up so many people's sleep schedule. But thank you guys again for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good night and maybe learn something, and we'll pick up with conflict on Thursday. Yeah, so good night.